So, thank you so much, Katrine, for that wonderful introduction and for your passion about this topic, which obviously is my passion as well. I think that we, as a rule, society does not recognize just how horrible and prevalent partner violence is, or domestic violence even more generally. And I'm really, really excited to be here to share what I know with all of you and try to help uncover this, what I refer to often as a hidden epidemic. So we're going to start with my slide. So I'm going to be talking today about something that I just say understanding Concussion-Plus. And I'm going to get to that in a minute, and Katrine actually introduced it really nicely because she started talking about acquired brain injuries and mentioning things like strangulation. And so I'm going to go through this with you through my lecture. But when we talk about brain injuries, at least in the States, and I think it's pretty much here too, we often think of the sports, the athletes, or maybe car accidents or something. But what I want you to leave here today with thinking is actually when we think about brain injuries, we really want to be thinking about a lot of the women who are among us and walking among us who probably have unrecognized, undiagnosed brain injuries, and not just quote unquote concussions or mild traumatic brain injuries, but also acquired brain injuries from strangulation. So I have no financial relationships to disclose. I do have some grant funding, internal funding, and I will say that this content may be difficult for some people. I do this every day, and it's still not always easy to me. I've had people say, oh my gosh, when I read that case, I got PTSD just from reading about what happened. And so please take care of yourself. If you need to step out, I won't be offended. Do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself if you feel triggered or really upset by some of this content. I am not going to be telling you the worst of the worst, believe me, and I could make it more real. But I will try to let you know the gravity of the situation in a way that is more palatable. And I try to take care of myself too, and this is me yesterday at Kangaroo Island holding a koala. So if anyone hasn't held a koala, highly, highly recommend it. This is a tough job that I do, and so when I have an opportunity to make myself feel better, I try to take it, and animals are my thing. So I want to start out by talking about Freya. It's not a real name, but I want you to learn about a woman who approached me, and so you can kind of have an understanding of who we're talking about when we're talking about women who have experienced partner violence. They're all different. Many of them have similar stories, but they're all unique in their own way. So she was 46 when she approached me, and she told me about her partner who, when she was with this partner, he isolated her, brought her out somewhere, so she basically didn't really have anywhere else to go. He would smash her head regularly against door jambs or walls. She would just be walking by, and if he felt like it, he'd just smash her head into the door jamb because he felt like it. He strangled her and gave her petechia, so the red dots above the strangulation point. And basically, if a paramedic came or in the doctor, or he would be with her, and she would have to say it was from something else. So as a medical professional, if you're going to ask somebody, did your partner ever do this to you, make sure the partner's not actually in the room with you. Chased her down with a shotgun. She woke up from being strangled 10 times. He threw her off the porch onto hard, dry clay. And she reported often feeling woozy from abuse, AKA probably very disoriented, et cetera, from brain injuries. And this is not a woman who was just like, she wasn't ever smart, she wasn't, she was just I think sometimes people think, oh, people are in these relationships, who are they? Are they worthwhile? Right? I guess in the States, it doesn't seem like they're worthwhile because we have very little funding for women, whereas we have tons of funding for athletes. But that aside, she was actually incredibly, incredibly intelligent. And she had in high school, she had the reading comprehension of a college senior. And now, at the age of 46, very common words weren't making sense to her. She was like, she'd have to go to the dictionary to find out, what's this word? Just really strange things. She was forgetting names of people she knew and had relationships with. And she reported, I have anxiety and panic for no reason. I am in a loving relationship now. I'm married with this wonderful partner. What's going on with me? And this really scared her. So that was Freya. And I'm going to end to tell you what happened with Freya after she learned about what I'm going to talk to you today about. So, IPV, intimate partner violence. That's all it means. And IPV, very simply speaking, is basically violence perpetrated by a current or former spouse, significant other, girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever. You don't have to be married to that person. You don't have to have a strong relationship with that person. Any intimate relationship. Domestic violence is a little more global, or a lot more global. It includes elder abuse and child abuse. IPV is focusing on that intimate relationship, and it doesn't have to be anything more than that. It could be for a day, and it doesn't have to happen actually in the house. So here are some what I refer to as quote-unquote fun facts of IPV. It's the leading cause of homicide for women globally. The leading cause of homicide for women globally. If you knew that a woman was murdered, and that's all you knew about her, and somebody said, who do you think did it? Your best bet would be not on some stranger, but on a current or past partner. That's where the odds would be. That to me is a horrifying fact. It's also the most common form of violence against women. So when I travel around the world giving lectures, people will be, oh, be careful, be careful. And I'm like, no, actually, who should be careful are the women who are in the homes with their partners, because I'm much safer out on the streets of Chicago or New Zealand or London or whatever, because I have a husband at home who treats me well. I'm safer than a lot of women. It's also found across all socioeconomic boundaries. So it is absolutely true that certain groups of women are disproportionately affected. Unfortunately, Indigenous women, there's people who are often ostracized in different ways, tend to be disproportionately affected by partner violence. But it happens to everybody. Affluent women, white, black, brown, doesn't matter who you are. Don't think it doesn't happen in my community, because it does. I'm just going to tell you a really quick story about Anna Walsh. She lived not too far from where I live, and I live in Boston, and she kind of went missing. Something happened. She was supposed to be in DC, and then she didn't show up, and there was a news article about it because she's affluent. And I said to my husband, as soon as I saw this, I said, her husband killed her. I didn't know anything else, but that was my guess. And to this day, we don't know what happened to her for sure, because she has never been found. She never turned up. But they finally took the husband in for questioning, et cetera, and now he's on trial or whatever, being held because he's gonna go into court, because they found things on his computer like this: how long before a body starts to smell, how to stop a body from decomposing, 10 ways to dispose of a dead body if you really need to, how long for someone to be missing to inherit, can identification be made on partial remains, what happens when you put body parts in ammonia, can you be charged with murder without a body? So to this day, we don't know for sure he killed her, but is anyone in this room doubting what happened? And I knew what happened just because I knew she went missing. Now, I could have been wrong, but I wasn't. And this was not some women. In the United States, we have what's called missing and murdered Indigenous women. They are constantly disappearing. It's just such a travesty. But not just for certain people, it's everyone. So what are the real numbers? 1 in 3 women experience intimate partner violence. It depends on who you ask, the definition you use, et cetera, but this is a pretty good number globally, 1 in 3 women. So when I say this, I want to say that I know for a fact that I'm looking in this audience, and somebody here has experienced partner violence. Probably many people here have experienced partner violence. I know that for a fact. You may not know it, but it's there. It's everywhere. People don't like to talk about it. It's very stigmatizing. And people also don't like to offend somebody by talking about it because people don't know how to respond to it. But I want people to understand that this is happening all around us. This is not just those people over there. If you know 9 women, not what 1, not what 2, but which 3 of those women may have experienced partner violence, that's what you should be thinking, because maybe you can help them. Maybe they're out of the relationship struggling, or maybe they're still in that relationship, I don't know. But until we start talking about it, we're not going to get to that. And the reason I say this is because these are not people over there. These are our daughters, these are our mothers, these are our children, these are our partners potentially who've had past violence. These are our friends. These are us. Okay, so I want people to understand that this is an us problem because people get more engaged when they actually believe it influences you and who you are and what's around you. So I really want us to understand that. So hopefully that's clear that IPV is a global health epidemic. Oops, sorry, I went a little fast with that one. There we go. Unfortunately, and this is where we get to why we're talking about this at a brain injury conference, 80 to 90% of injuries to women are to the head or neck. I've had women tell me about being stomped on the head with work boots, punched in the head repeatedly with a fist, smashed in the head with a hammer, and hit in the head with a baseball bat. Okay? These are not the worst. I could easily say worse, and this is not uncommon. Women who experience partner violence also report high rates of cognitive, physical, and emotional problems. Anyone in here who knows about post-concussive symptoms will look at those and say, oh yeah, those are absolutely, that's like a list of post-concussive symptoms. I don't even need to repeat them for you, because if you know what post-concussive symptoms are, women commonly report those, women who experience partner violence. We've known this for years. Long before anyone said anything about partner violence and brain injury, we knew those things were happening with women, but it was, to our knowledge, right, because of the psychological trauma of being in such a horrible situation, which I believe is true, it is, but it's also because they're being smashed in the heads with objects or fists, et cetera. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about TBI, traumatic brain injury. We're at a TBI conference. I don't think I really need to explain to people what a TBI is, but for the purposes of understanding how I defined a TBI in my studies, we'll just say TBI was an external force to the head and disrupted brain function. And so that's manifested by, we have a hit jolt or external force to the head that results in any loss of consciousness, any loss of memory for events immediately before or after the incident, any alteration in mental state at the time, so being really confused, disoriented, or focal neurological deficit, like seeing stars or spots or something like that. So when I asked my women about brain injuries, I didn't say, by the way, have you ever sustained a brain injury? Most of them probably would have said no, or I don't know, or what is that? I said, after anything your partner ever did to you, did you ever lose consciousness? After anything your partner ever did to you, did you ever have memory loss before or after whatever happened? And then if they said yes, then I said, what happened? And if they said I was hit in the head, or I was strangled, or something like that, then I would follow up. And then I would identify whether or not it was brain injury. If they said, well, I was forced to consume, a pint of vodka, that's not a brain injury. It's not good, but basically that's how I got at that, because you can't just ask somebody about if they've sustained a brain injury, because as later research that I've done shows, they wouldn't necessarily understand how to answer that. So now I want to talk about strangulation. This is the plus part of the Concussion-Plus. And why do we talk about strangulation? Katrine actually was really good in talking about strangulation, and I was really happy to hear that. But people in the IPV world, or the domestic violence world, don't necessarily think of this as a brain injury, but strangulation is a serious form of abuse that can cause an acquired brain injury, okay? Strangulation, if a woman tells you she was choked, absolutely respect that. That is a term that when I'm talking with a woman or somebody who's experienced it is absolutely acceptable. But when I talk to a group of people like you, academics, et cetera, it's strangulation. Choking is when you have something lodged inside your throat. Strangulation is an external attack on the neck. Okay? Strangulation can cause things like asphyxia. You hear terms like hypoxia or anoxia. All those terms mean is basically depriving the body or cells of oxygen. So asphyxia is basically the general term, and then if you have complete lack of oxygen, it's anoxia. If you have partial lack of oxygen, it's hypoxia. So that's all that means. So when we talk about what strangulation is a form of asphyxia from external pressure placed upon the neck, such that there's an obstruction of blood flow from or to the brain via the jugular or the carotid, or an obstruction of the airway. When I first started doing this, I thought strangulation was if you just pressed really hard, it would take a lot of pressure, right? Because you got to press on the carotid, you got to actually block the airflow. No, actually strangulation is much, much more kind of horrible than that. Oops, I didn't realize, I got to watch where I am here. If you just press on the neck, we have the jugular vein, which is coming out, taking out the kind of the dirty used blood. And we have the carotids, which bring up that nice oxygen-rich blood. All you need to do, I'm going to put this down so I don't keep making that noise. If you press on this, it doesn't take a lot. It's very, very, very easy to strangle somebody without leaving any mark. And in fact, a really famous study showed that like half of the women who were strangled, there were no marks. These are serious strangulation incidents. So if you press a little bit on the necks and you compress the jugular, which is a little bit more lateral than the carotid, then you still have oxygen-rich blood going into the brain, but you don't have an outlet. Blood can't leave the brain. So you have blood going into a space that doesn't get any bigger. So that can cause increased intracranial pressure. Okay, so that's not good. But then if you press a little bit harder, then, well, now you don't have that blood going into the brain, so you don't have to worry about increased intracranial pressure, but now you have to worry about asphyxia. The brain is not getting the oxygen and the nutrients that it needs to survive. So those cells can die pretty quickly. And then if you press even harder, then you can actually just block air from coming into the body, and that's going to obviously create asphyxia as well. So blood buildup or lack of enough oxygen from strangulation can cause damage very quickly. Blood buildup can cause unconsciousness within 2 minutes. Anoxia can cause unconsciousness within 10 seconds. And strangulation can cause brain death in less than 4 minutes while leaving no external mark. So for the paramedic who said, oh, you couldn't have been strangled because I don't see any marks, they really need to go back to school. Okay? It's extremely common. So if someone says they've been choked or strangled, don't think, oh, I don't see anything because it wasn't serious. It easily could have resulted in acquired brain injury. And damage may result in death days later. It's not super common, but some women have, from a continued swelling or something like that, or carotid dissection, died days after they were strangled because they didn't get the proper medical attention and it wasn't recognized. So this, when we talk about women who are experiencing partner violence, I talk about concussions, but then I also talk about strangulation. And that's what I refer to as Concussion-Plus. And the reason I like to say this is because when we think of brain injuries, we're often thinking about concussions with athletes, repetitive brain injuries. And those are like the same type of blunt force trauma to the head or subconcussive hits or whatever. But they're not also sustaining strangulation-related alterations in consciousness. Okay? So when we think of women who are experiencing partner violence, we need to recognize this as a unique group of people who are experiencing severe violence and potentially 2 types of acquired brain injuries. Concussion-Plus. Okay, so let's see, how am I doing on time? 10:04. And Nick's gonna cut me, but so I have a clock that I usually have, but because of Jetstar's weight limitations, I didn't want to bring it. So you'll have to bear with me if I check my clock every once in a while on this. So way back when I realized that, I was working with women who were in a shelter, and I realized, wow, these women are getting hit in the head. And in my academic studies, I was learning that, well, gee, if you get hit in the head, you could have a brain injury, and that could result in depression, that could result in cognitive issues, et cetera. But no one was talking about it. So I went to the literature. I said, what do we know about this? 0, absolutely nothing. So I decided, okay, we got to look at this. And so I have done this, and now, luckily, like 28 years later or something, it's actually a field. It wasn't a field then, but now we have a field. It's a tiny field, but it's emerging, and it's really exciting to see this happen. But when I did my study, I wanted to see, okay, what do we know? Okay, it seems like women are sustaining brain injuries. What are the real numbers? We don't have good epidemiological data. I will tell you that right now, because this hasn't been deemed as important as it should be for someone to do a really good epi study, like the government or center. But in my study, what I found was that out of the 99 women I interviewed, 74% sustained at least one IPV-related brain injury. Okay, 74%. So if we look at that 42 million in the United, sorry, I have to use United States statistics because that's where I'm from, and I kind of know those data better. But 42 million women, by the 1 in 3 number, have sustained sexual or physical partner violence in the United States. And so if we try to extrapolate that, that could be 31 million women in the United States alone walking around with probably unrecognized, undiagnosed brain injuries. What's even more disturbing was that, oh, a little jumpy there, just over half sustained repetitive brain injuries. It might have been 1 or 2, it might have been like 2 or 3 or 4 or 6, but for some of these women it was simply too many to count. Like that woman that I told you about earlier, Freya. She constantly had brain injuries. And if we look at those numbers, over 21 million women in the United States alone potentially sustaining repetitive brain injuries from their partners. This is crazy. This is worse than athletics. We still don't have the funding for it, but nonetheless, this is crazy. And we could say, okay, well, maybe you got all the women who are particularly injured, and it's not the case, but I'll get to that in a minute. But even if we cut that in half or cut that in quarters, 5 million women sustaining repetitive brain injuries that are not really recognized in the United States alone, these numbers are just crazy. We need to do more here. And a follow-up study a couple years later, we looked, now people are actually starting to ask this question. And so in any study that we could find that actually had any indication of the prevalence of brain injury in their sample. Again, samples of convenience, not epidemiological studies, but on the high end, some studies were finding every single woman in their study had a brain injury. And on the low end, it was like 27%. So this is not uncommon. This was 18 studies. This really happens. And now there's studies, I'll tell you about that in a minute. Hold on. So it's not just that they're sustaining brain injuries. We can actually link these brain injuries to cognitive and psychological outcomes, negative cognitive and psychological outcomes. Women with higher brain injury scores, the higher brain injury scores were associated with poorer performance on tests of memory learning and cognitive flexibility, and higher ratings of general distress, depression, anxiety, and PTSD symptomatology. So it's not just that we're counting these things and it doesn't mean anything. It really has negative effects on these women. And for many of them, it's years later. This is not accounted, so it wasn't accounted for by necessarily the severity of the abuse or for the cognitive relationships, for just the fact that there's psychopathology there, or substance abuse. We controlled for these in our analyses. We could see real links between the brain injuries, the number of brain injuries, and these negative outcomes. Okay, so now I want to take a minute to talk about brain connectivity. I'm not going to do too much here or get into too much detail, but these were the first couple of studies that I did, and anyone who wants to talk to me about more detail later can. But as a neuroscientist, I know that I know certain things that if I were a lawyer, I don't know. And so I try to keep it nice and simple that everyone can understand it. We use MRI to measure brain connectivity. And connectivity we can have structural or functional connectivity. Structural connectivity just deals with parts of brain cells that connect different regions, okay? And then functional connectivity is really referring to like regions of the brain that aren't necessarily right next to each other, but are working together. We have lots of functional networks in our brain. The idea that, we just have a region of the brain that does X or Y or Z is true. We do have areas of specificity in terms of what the brain functions are, but we know that the connections between those regions is really, really important. And so we know that both structural and functional connectivity are critical for optimal behavior and optimal performance, right? This is something we know. We've learned this time and time again. And traumatic brain injuries involve injury to brain cells that can affect structural and functional connectivity. So this is important to look at. So if we just look kind of a real quick demonstration here for, many of you will probably know all about this, but just in case. So we have an axon there, we have a neuron there, because if it's in the brain, it would be a neuron. We have the cell body there. I really don't have a pointer, but I labeled the axon. That's really thin and can break easily, right? They're very microscopic and tiny. But when you have really strong forces to the brain, you can either tear or break or shear those axons. And so if you do that, that brain cell may not be able to communicate effectively or at all with the other brain cells that it needs to communicate with. And so when we talk about concussions in general, if you put someone in a scan after a concussion, right, a simple concussion, you generally won't see anything. The brain will look fine, right? And the reason is it's not that, nothing happened, nothing bad happened. It's because many of these axons, if we still have problems, right, if the person's symptomatic, it's because one of the things is that these axons may have been broken, but they're little tiny things, and they may have broken all over the brain. So there's this term we use, diffuse axonal injury. Diffuse, because it's happening in many areas. Axonal, because it's affecting that axon, and injury. So an MRI or a CT scan is not going to pick up these little tiny injuries throughout the brain, but they have effects. So in this first study that they were looking at structural connectivity, based on a study that was done in American football players, they found certain longer fiber tracts. A fiber tract is just axons that kind of bind together to form a bundle. And they found that there was the way the water was moving along those axons. It's a term we can use that's referred to as fractional anisotropy. They found that it was different for the folks who had sustained repetitive brain injuries from football versus those who had not in a few areas. And so I said, okay, can I see that in my women? If I look in these specific areas, can I see it? And actually for 2 of the 3 areas I did. What I found was that the number of brain injuries that the woman had sustained was related to fractional anisotropy in the posterior and superior coronal radiata. This is an image of the brain, and these are color-coded axons. They don't really look that pretty in the brain. They're all kind of gray or white matter. But it's color-coded according to the direction of the water flowing. At any rate, we were able to link that to the number of brain injuries. So it's basically saying, okay, we take athletes seriously, we take what we find in them seriously. Well, this is just analogous to that. So we really need to take this seriously. And then in the next study, I looked at functional connectivity and found that brain injuries were associated with functional connectivity, which was associated with memory and learning. So just to break this down, again, this was a group in the UK, Sharp and colleagues, have done a lot of really nice work where they show that the anterior insula and how it's connected to other networks in the brain really is affected by brain injuries. And so we said, okay, if we look at that region, the anterior insula, can we see how it's differentially affected according, and relate it to the number of brain injuries a woman has sustained? And we did. The more recent and the greater number of brain injuries that a woman had, the less positively those 2 brain regions communicated, the posterior cingulate precuneus and the right anterior insula. And then what's even more important is that the less these 2 brain regions communicated with one another, the worse women tended to be able to learn a list of words and remember that list of words 20 minutes later. So it's not just like, okay, we're finding these things in the scanner and okay, but what does it mean? Well, yeah, that's what it means. This is not good. It's not good for people. All right, so now there's been a few more imaging studies. There's still almost none. I could probably count them on 1 or maybe 2 hands. But like I said, more are coming out. This is an emerging field, so I'm very grateful for that. But basically, we're going to be finding out a lot more as the years come, so stay tuned. So if we talk about strangulation, well, how frequently are women strangled? Rates of strangulation vary depending on how it's measured, but the numbers are always high. If you just say, did your partner ever choke you, again, using a word that a woman might more commonly use, 86% in that sample of 99 women reported being, quote unquote, choked by their partners. But that doesn't get to me what I want to know about whether or not there was an acquired brain injury, because you could be, quote unquote, choked or strangled and still not have an alteration in consciousness. So if I ask after anything your partner ever did you ever lose consciousness, have memory loss, et cetera, 27% said yes and then responded that they were strangled by their partner. So to me, that says that 27% of the women in that sample sustained some type of probably acquired brain injury from strangulation from their partner. So again, that's a really high number. Not only that, again, if we look at whether or not these alterations in consciousness from strangulation are related to other outcomes, they are. Women who experienced strangulation-related alterations in consciousness were more likely to have poorer performance on tests of memory, both long-term and working memory, look at that, and higher rates of depression and post-traumatic stress. So again, and I also accounted for, statistically speaking, both child abuse and the number of IPV-related traumatic brain injuries. Because we could say, well, you just showed me that traumatic brain injuries are associated with things, but when we control for that, there is an independent association from that strangulation-related alteration in consciousness. That first study I told you about was just a sample in the United States. We did another study where we had 4 countries, US, Canada, Spain, and Colombia. And we found 67 prevalence rate of brain injuries, so including TBIs and strangulation-related alterations in consciousness. So in other words, this is not rare. It's not just in the United States, and it's not just one study. This is very common. And in a subsample of if you had at least one IPV-related brain injury, we found that 2% had these strangulation-related alterations in consciousness only, okay? But 37% had both, and 41% had TBI only. So what this tells me is that if you know someone has been strangled and has sustained some alteration in consciousness, there's a very, very high likelihood that they have also sustained some type of blunt force trauma, traumatic brain injury as well. And it may not necessarily go the other way around, but I think this is really important to know because sometimes people know a woman has been strangled, but they, it's like, okay, let's deal with that. But you really want to follow up and make sure they haven't also sustained basically a concussion or a mild traumatic brain injury. And overall, across all of these data, we found that women were more likely to sustain moderate to severe traumatic brain injuries if they were strangled and has sustained alteration in consciousness. Oh, Jesus keeps going ahead of me. Sorry about that. And women with strangulation-related alterations in consciousness also had higher levels of PTSD symptomatology and depression. So it's a really serious event, being strangled. And it's also one of the most horrifying events someone can endure. Just check. Oh, good. What I want to do now is tell you a little bit about a qualitative study that we're just finishing up. And it's been done actually in collaboration with Drs. Alice Theodem and Jason Chua in New Zealand, so kind of your neck of the woods. And it's understanding brain injury in the context of the complexities of IPV, and just sort of letting women tell us what things were like for them. Because I know what questions I might want to ask, but I might not always ask the right question. But we did want to understand a little bit better what was going on with women when they were experiencing brain injuries from IPV. And were they seeking help, why or why not, et cetera. And a few themes emerged. Oh, there's Isha, I'm sorry, I want to acknowledge Isha, who is a main contributor to the study, and also Sarah Rose, who are off in medical school in Boston and California right now. But they are really great with this study. So some of the themes, one was that brain health was not a priority at the time of injury. And when I talk about these things, part of what I want to do, what I always want to do, is have people think of, when we think of brain injuries, we're often thinking, again, of the athlete on the field, or someone in a car accident, or maybe a military individual, somebody who's, in the military. And so there's sort of this recognition that brain injuries may have happened, and there's sort of this attention to it. For women who are experiencing partner violence behind closed doors, that's not necessarily the case, and we're going to get to some of that here. And I want people to really think about what that means for these women. So in this, I'm going to read a quote from this one woman, and this is what she says. No, it didn't occur to me. I really was more concerned with getting the glass cleaned up off the floor because, I had a toddler who's going to be crawling around. I called his mom for help and said, we just had a fight. I didn't tell her he strangled me, but I just said I needed help getting it cleaned up. I never thought that I should have gotten help. Never even occurred. I had no idea that he crushed everything in my neck, and then it would plague me for the rest of my life and be a huge part of my disability. And for this woman, she didn't realize that the problem she was having was really related to that incident until much later. And she was misdiagnosed quite a bit. But again, didn't even get help because that's not a priority. You need to take care of your children. Another one was understanding of traumatic brain injury was mixed. This one woman said, I didn't know if I was dazed because I hit my head or because I was shocked at what happened, because that was the first time I ever got hit so. For people who are on the athletic field or these other situations, I think you kind of usually know, like, yeah, I just took a dinger to the head or whatever, and I know that these are this. But for women, they're not even sure what's going on because it's such a traumatic experience on top of this other horrible experience. And then I just never really thought much into it. I have people who I know that have TBI that they've been in car accidents, things like that. And their speech is affected, other things are affected because of that. And so, no, I didn't think anything of it. So this woman's definition of a traumatic brain injury was like, you needed to really look like you sustained a brain injury. In other words, to her, really significant, obvious functional impairments. But she had sustained many brain injuries, and she was struggling because of them. And then another theme was that there are many barriers to disclosing brain injury. And this one is really heartbreaking to me, this woman. She says, I was very scared because a lot of the times he was telling me that I would be like admitted to a hospital, and sometimes he would even show me pictures of these rooms that had like foam on the wall. I was scared that because I couldn't explain what was happening to me. How can I explain to someone what's happening to me? And they're gonna think I'm crazy. He would tell me, oh, let's go to the hospital. I might never see you again, and you're not gonna see your family again. And it's just, I was all alone here, and an immigrant. I thought that they would like restrain me, or like strap me into a chair or something. I thought I was crazy. So needless to say, she's not getting help for her brain injuries because she's not even getting help for anything. She doesn't even know what's going on. She's an immigrant. He's gaslighting her, basically telling her her experiences aren't real. What she's thinking is not really going on. Creating situations that aren't true. No one's going to really strap her in if she goes to the hospital. But he's basically making it so hard for her to really think like, I'm going to go and get treatment, and this is going to be helpful. So, what can we do? Well, I think the first thing is that we want to understand that women are often trapped in a dangerous and terrifying situation. People with the best intentions in mind will talk about individuals who are like, yeah, I know this woman, and I just don't understand why she doesn't leave. And they may even ask her, why don't you just leave? That's actually victim blaming. And I kind of understand that not everyone understands us the way I do, but when we really understand what's going on, this is a power and control wheel. And this is not just for women who are experiencing partner violence, but this is what many women who are experiencing partner violence are dealing with. So the range is huge. I could literally talk for a full hour on how women are controlled by their partners, or why, quote unquote, they don't leave. And I don't ever like even saying that. It's like, why doesn't he stop abusing her is the question we should ask. But there's a lot of things. I mean, we all get into relationships, why? Because we love the person, right? Or we like the person. Sometimes we think, oh, they're gonna change, or we hope they're gonna change. And sometimes we think, I can't leave because I would be ostracized by my family. Or my family says, you just need to make it work. Or sometimes it's because they're controlling your every move and every behavior and are stalking you and tracking your every move and said you can never leave. For as long as you're alive, you will be with me. And if you ever try to leave me, I will kill you. And as we know, that's a very likely scenario. And women are most likely to be murdered either when they're planning to leave or leaving, or after they've left. So it's not something like, oh, yeah, he says that, but he doesn't mean it. No, it happens. That's a very real threat. And if we just look, there's intimidation, verbal attacks. As I mentioned earlier, women are often isolated. We'll use loved ones. You'll never see your kids again. Or I'm going to kill the dog. All sorts of things. And then women may not have means, right? Especially if they're isolated and they've been basically, he doesn't let me work anymore, so I'm reliant on him. What am I going to do? How am I going to go and just go somewhere else? Shelters? Well, they may or may not have shelters, and that shelter may not be able to take my dog. There's so many levels of complexity. And then you put a brain injury on top of this. Trying to get out of a situation that is potentially lethal is hard enough. And if you have one or more brain injuries that you're managing, and you may not even know that that's what's going on, it becomes next to impossible. So we really need to understand how challenging and complex this situation is for women who've experienced or are experiencing partner violence and very possibly brain injuries as well. So what I want to do is I want everyone to start talking about it. COVID came, I found silver linings because people are talking about IPV, domestic violence, during COVID. And I said, good, finally, because people saw as COVID went around the globe, more like COVID was here, IPV rates went up. COVID was here, IPV rates went up. And that's what we know. We know that when there's global crises or disasters, IPV tends to go up for all sorts of reasons. And so basically, so we saw these articles come, and I said, oh, this is great. And I said, I'm going to take the opportunity to write about this gender-based violence and say, okay, it's great we're talking about this, but let's also remember that if there's greater violence, there's greater likelihood of brain injuries, both strangulation-related brain injuries and traumatic brain injuries. And so that was one of the things that I did for COVID, that I was just like, okay, this is a silver lining here, because I probably wouldn't have gotten that article out otherwise. The other thing is we want to keep in mind the high likelihood that IPV-related TBI or strangulation may have occurred. If you're dealing with anyone who's experienced partner violence, I'm not going to say it always will have occurred, but keep in mind that it may have. Have the right questions been asked? A woman will not necessarily know that she sustained a brain injury. She won't necessarily consider it. And she may not recognize the relevance of reporting it. Yeah, I was hit in the head, but I'm okay right now. If she has a broken bone, well, you kind of can't walk around with your arm dangling all over the place, right? You have to go to the hospital. Well, actually, sometimes partners don't even let them go. But nonetheless, that's what will drive women to the hospital. Blood coming out of something, or broken bones, or basically physical things that are obvious to other people and that really are right there. You can't kind of get around it. But, I can't think straight. I have headaches. I'm dizzy. I don't necessarily have the time or the energy to go see a doctor about this, right? So make sure that the importance of understanding what a brain injury can mean is relayed to her. And then, it keeps going ahead on me. I have a trigger finger here. And then I think, as most of you probably know, a negative scan does not mean that there's no brain injury. I give this lecture to all sorts of people, and a lot of people are like, oh, I want to make sure she goes to get a brain scan because then we'll know she has brain injury. No, actually, that might not be a good idea because then it may seem like she has no brain injury, even though she does, because we know that that's not the case. Scans typically do not pick up your kind of typical brain injuries. How am I doing on time, Nick? 15. Whoa, I'm doing good. Thank you. So, and the other thing is that brain injuries unseen behind closed doors are likely to be misinterpreted or missed. So, I think this is really one of the most important things we can think about. And it affects women who are experiencing partner violence and brain injuries in potentially so many different ways. Because when we think of brain injuries, oftentimes it's obvious to a lot of different people. Right? There's many people who may, again, athletes, because that's where we know a lot of our brain injury information from. Maybe the whole country has seen you sustain that hit, saw that person get knocked down, and then they kind of can't get up, or they're stumbling, or they think they're somewhere else. And as a group of people, we're not like, is that person drunk? We're not thinking like, what's wrong with that person? We're like, whoa, that person just sustained a concussion. That person sustained a brain injury. And we kind of get it because we saw the hit, we saw what happened, and so we can understand that, yeah, they may actually have some problems right now. Maybe they can't walk straight, maybe they're dizzy, even though they're looking like this. I'm not going to assume that they just went and had a drink. I know exactly what happened. However, if we go to women who are experiencing partner violence, not always, but typically it's behind closed doors, where usually the abuser will see the violence, and then the person will experience it. Maybe children, but nonetheless, it's pretty private. And so we have a paramedic or a police officer who shows up at the door and sees a woman who is disoriented, confused, distractible, inconsistent, They say, well, you were in the bedroom, but you talked about being in the bathroom. And she's like, I don't know. Like, how did you get from, I don't know how I got from the bedroom to the bathroom, right? Okay, well, this isn't looking so good for her, right? She may have like a headache, or she's holding her head, seeming uncooperative, like, because they're confused, right? Like, I don't know, what are you doing here? And no, stop telling me this or that. Like, I don't know. Like, no, I don't know how. Ma'am, just tell me what happened. I don't know what happened. Seeming dizzy, or maybe off balance. And then maybe there's some beer bottles in the background, or maybe there's drug paraphernalia or whatever. What do you think that first responder is going to think? And then we may have the partner who's saying, this was just a little argument. She always goes a little crazy. She's just like this. She's a screamer. The neighbors heard and called, but everything is fine here. And so his story is nice and linear, seems reasonable. She's all over the place. Okay, she's drunk, she's intoxicated. Okay, come on, let's get things together, whatever. If you don't think that maybe a brain injury occurred, your most likely guess is that this person's intoxicated. Because unfortunately, those two things look very similar. And that is just absolutely horrific when you think about that. Because now we have a woman who may have just sustained a brain injury, but if you didn't ask about the possibility that a brain injury occurred, what's going to happen is the officer's going to say, we showed up, domestic dispute, he said there was just yelling, she was uncooperative, et cetera. She was probably intoxicated. And then that may go, if it goes to the courts, then that's going to be in the record as well. Versus, anyway, so basically in the courts, then you might not get restitution, you might lose your kids, all sorts of negative stuff that I don't have time to really go into. Versus somebody shows up and says, ma'am, did you forget anything that happened today after, anything your partner did to you? She's just like, yeah, I don't know, how I got from the bedroom to the bathroom. And what happened right before that? Well, he smashed my head into the sink. Okay. Well, now I'm thinking, gee, maybe she doesn't remember A, because he dragged her into the bedroom as she was unconscious, because he didn't want people to see her lying on the bathroom floor. Instead, they would see her in a bed lying there like she was just drunk. Or maybe she walked into the bedroom but has amnesia from it because she just sustained a concussion. So now we have a situation where a brain injury would be recognized if you ask the right questions, or if that paramedic asked the right questions, versus this woman's just intoxicated. Huge difference, because then we get to the courts, and maybe that person, maybe that officer will actually suggest she go and get medical attention. Now, she can deny whatever, but the point is it will be documented that maybe a brain injury has occurred. So you get to the courts, and instead of her being this crazy, unreliable witness who wasn't cooperating, et cetera, she's someone who just sustained serious bodily injury. And this is a serious offense. So just that little tiny difference, none of the facts have changed at all, but the recognition that a brain injury may have occurred could make all the difference in the world. And so I just can't emphasize enough that when we don't see these brain injuries occurring, we need to actually ask about the possibility that they may have occurred. And we're not going to generally see them because abusers tend to do this in private. Some do it in public as well. That's when it's really frightening. And not only that, but some abusers are really smart. And they know that if you see bruises, like I'll bruise pretty easily, right? And so somebody will be like, ooh, I don't want them, it's gonna be obvious she's abused if I hit her in the face or, do something else. So they hit in the back of the head. They slam in the head anywhere where you can't see a bruise. I've had many women tell me that. Oh, he's real smart. He knows how to hit me where there's no marks. And where is that? The head. So it's really absolutely critical to understand if you don't see what's going on, you really don't know unless you ask. Okay. Now, I would say 99% of what we know about brain injuries are based on male individuals. And I think most people would agree to this because it's either athletes, again, or folks in the military. And I will argue that, women who are experiencing partner violence, if we say there's negative effects from the injuries that men are sustaining, these women are sustaining, what these women are going through is going to probably lead to things that are even more negative outcomes. Why? Because the recovery factors are all on the worst end of the scale. For example, if you have a brain injury, the best thing you can do, and you know it's a concussion, get management right away. If you look at the brain injury protocols for people who have sustained concussions, like in the United States, we have this on game day, what they go through, this whole list. And then after game day, this whole list. Like, we know exactly what's happening with those people, and we can make sure they get the best possible care and the best possible outcome. If women don't even know they're sustaining brain injuries, they're not getting any management, and that's typically what's happening. So they're going back to do their same old thing, and if they can't get something done, maybe they just try even harder, which is going to exacerbate it. And they're continuing to keep themselves in a risky situation for further brain injuries to make things even worse. And then if they have a brain injury, maybe it's going to be even worse because maybe they're not going to try to back off a little bit if the partner's doing something, because now they have a brain injury and they're not exercising as good judgment. So I can't emphasize enough. It's really important. History of previous brain injury is going to lead to more likely negative outcomes. Many of these women have repetitive brain injuries. Other bodily injuries or health risks, we know that many of these women are sustaining other bodily injuries as well, not just brain injuries. And then psychological stress, acute intense stress, and general life stress. All of these things are going to make it harder for the brain to recover optimally. And women who are experiencing partner violence generally have intense psychological distress in general, acute intense stress from the fear of potentially being killed in that moment, and then a general life stress of trying to manage everything that any of us have to manage in the context of an incredibly abusive and horrible situation. And then, in general, females, I know that some people will debate this a little bit, but in general, females tend to sustain concussions more easily given the same amount of force, and they also tend to take longer to recover. So if you put all this together, women who are experiencing partner violence and sustaining brain injuries are really at a negative end of the spectrum for an optimal recovery, even in the best case scenario. One thing that I always like to emphasize, I think this is super important, is that brain injuries can make it harder for women to survive, escape, or keep her children, but we don't want anyone ever saying it means she's unfit to keep her children. This is really important for example, in legal situations, et cetera. I don't have time to go into it, but yes, a judge will actually take children away from a woman because she's got PTSD or maybe a brain injury and give the children to the person who caused that. I have no idea how that makes sense, but we need to educate judges that just because you have a brain injury does not mean you're not able to take care of your children. So ultimately, we want to interact with women in a way that is sensitive to the possibility that brain injury has occurred. And these things that I'm going to show you here are just anything that you would use in any situation where somebody may have sustained a brain injury. Do one task at a time and stick to that task. Be factual and concrete. Allow extra time or help her to complete tasks. Maybe even fill out forms for her. Point out possible consequences of decisions she may need to make. And provide respectful feedback on problem areas that affect her safety if she thinks she's functioning better than she is. Okay? So we need to be sensitive. We need to act in a very trauma-informed manner and let her know, well, you might do that, but if you do, then this might be a negative consequence. But really, this is the case for anybody who's sustained a brain injury. And encourage self-determination and identify strengths. These women are so resilient. I mean, I cannot believe that some of the people I'm talking to are still alive, genuinely. So basically what I like to say is that I think everybody needs to know about this. And I don't care who you are, what profession you are, raising awareness is critical. Every woman you know, first responders, police and paramedics, I've already given you examples of that, judges, for obvious reasons, IPV support staff. I've had women who work in shelters and say, oh, I've never thought of this. Now I'm thinking of this woman in a totally new light. Oh my gosh, yeah, I feel like I failed her because they didn't recognize, they thought maybe she was just kind of lazy or not doing what she was supposed to do. Once you recognize this, you have much more empathy and understanding. And then women themselves. They don't necessarily know that the brain injury caused this. They don't necessarily understand how it may be influencing their ability to function or maybe even hindering their ability to leave the abusive situation. And then we know virtually nothing about the long-term consequences in neurodegeneration later on. We're going to start to learn about that. So I'm going to get back to Freya now. She saw an article of mine, and it could have been anyone's article, right? It just happened to be mine. And she was like, oh, check, check, check. Like, this is me. These are the things that are me. And she recognized her symptoms. She got the proper help, and it was life-changing. She is happy now. She's an ambassador for Pink Concussions. She packs her bags and goes and tells her stories. She adjusts her schedule so that she knows instead of pushing herself harder, she should draw back or whatever. It has been life. Just the knowledge has been so amazing. So don't, when I do this, it's like it's so depressing, right? Like, how can we like get over this? But there is promise. It doesn't mean that if you've sustained brain injuries that, okay, it's a lost cause. With the right help, we can totally change women's lives. And that's what I try to do. And then remember, every little support, every bit of support helps. I am like so overwhelmed. I have so much to do. I'm like, I have negative hours in my day. But we want to take advantage of the youth around us. And I'm going to show you just 2 examples how. If I wasn't worried about Jetstar's weight limitations, I would have remembered to bring these bracelets. Whenever I travel, I brought them to New Zealand, I've brought them all over the globe. I bring bracelets that my niece, who was 13 years old, started making. She's now actually at Princeton and a sophomore or whatever. Makes these bracelets. I say, I have a whole bunch of bracelets up here, and I say, anyone who is a survivor, who has lived experience, or who knows somebody, come up and take one, they're free of charge. And on the bracelet is a note that says, hi, my name is Veronica, and I made this bracelet in the hopes that you will know that you are deserving of love, recognition, and hope. And that little bracelet has made women cry. I've seen women wear it a year later, and I've had women say, no one's ever given me anything. It's such a huge thing for some women, and such a tiny thing for somebody else. And my son, he was taxed at his school with a fundraiser. He was like, no, I want to do it for Pink Concussions because no woman should have to be abused. No woman should be abused. It was dimes for dollars. They were supposed to make maybe 30 bucks. He raised $300. And he went on the Partner Inflicted Brain Injury Task Force, an international task force. And this is him zooming. He found that background. I don't even know. I was like, where did you get that background? And he presented at the age of 9. That's him. I don't even know how, to this day, I don't know where he got that background. My point is that if we don't have the time, our younger generation can. And I really want to think we should take advantage of our younger generation. And then finally, I just want to say, I really can't thank, I have to thank, Howard Barenbaum was the person who had confidence in me and said, yes, you can do this for your dissertation, even though it seemed absolutely crazy. And then since then, I've had students in my lab and interns. I have interns all over the United States coming to me, actually the globe, who are virtually joining in my lab because there's no other place for them to go, because there's not many labs doing this. And I have interns who are working for me for free, right? It's not like they're doing it for a paycheck or whatever, because they're so passionate about this. It's amazing, and so I really have to thank them. And then collaborators at MGH and Brigham. And then Nick, oh my gosh, thank you and the organizers for recognizing the importance of this topic. I don't think I've given talks all over the place, but I don't think I've ever given like a keynote for a really big conference before. And it's because usually if it's a brain injury conference, well, this is kind of lower level, which I just think is a little crazy, but nonetheless. So thank you so much to you and the organizers. I really appreciate it. This is a picture I took up in Cannes, because again, I need to take care of myself. And I want to thank you all for being here, for listening to me. And hopefully you will go home and you will talk more about partner violence, not be afraid to talk about it. We want to get rid of that stigma so that women feel like not only they're not alone, but they can talk about this and they're going to be accepted. Okay? And I also took that on Fitzroy Island. And thank you for having a beautiful country. And I was so honored to come here and present to you. Thank you so much.